He's talked about this pleasure-pain balance, that when we seek something that we really like or we indulge in it, like eating a little piece of chocolate, if we really like chocolate, there's some pleasure, but then there's a little bit of pain that exceeds the amount of pleasure, and it's subtle, and we experience it as wanting more of that thing. Okay, so there's a pleasure-pain balance, and I'm telling you that the pleasure and the pain are governed by dopamine to some extent. Well, how could that be, right? I've said before, when you engage in an activity or when you ingest something that increases dopamine, the dopamine levels go up, to a substantial degree with all the things I listed off. Where's the pain coming from? Well, the pain is coming from the lack of dopamine that follows, and you now know what that lack of dopamine reflects. How do you know? Well, earlier we were talking about how dopamine is released between neurons, and I mentioned two ways. One is into the synapse, where it can activate the postsynaptic neuron, and the other was what I called volumetric release, where it is distributed more broadly. It's released out over a bunch of neurons. In both cases, it's released from these things we call synaptic vesicles, literally little bubbles, tiny, tiny little bubbles that contain dopamine. They get vomited out into the area or into the synapse. Well, those vesicles get depleted. For the synaptic physiologists out there, we call this the readily releasable pool of dopamine. We can only deploy dopamine that is ready to be deployed, that's packaged in those little vesicles and ready to go. It's like when you order a product and they say out of stock until 2 months from now. Well, it's not ready to be released. Same thing with dopamine. There's a pool of dopamine that's synthesized, and you can only release the dopamine that's been synthesized. It's the readily releasable pool. The pleasure-pain balance doesn't only hinge on the readily releasable pool of dopamine, but a big part of the pleasure-pain balance hinges on how much dopamine is there and how much is ready and capable of being released into the system. So now we've given some meat to this thing that we call the pleasure-pain balance. And now it should make perfect sense why, if you take something or do something that leads to huge increases in dopamine, afterward your baseline should drop, because there isn't a lot of dopamine around to keep your baseline going.